Deep beneath the calm surface of New Mexico's Santa Rosa Blue Hole lies a haunting tale of exploration gone tragically wrong. What began as an adventurous dive into one of the most beautiful underwater caves ended in heartbreak, forever becoming part of the vault of tragic histories. This is the tragic story of Santa Rosa Blue Hole disaster. Santa Rosa Blue Hole in New Mexico is a breathtaking spot. Its crystal clear water reaches down about 80 feet, making it a popular place for swimmers and divers who come to train. It's a beautiful, spring-fed sinkhole, perfect for practicing scuba skills. But beneath that calm surface, there are secrets that few people have ever seen. Mysteries hidden under the rocky floor of the Blue Hole. For 40 years, the entrance to the caves below has been locked away behind a metal grate, keeping curious divers from entering. The reason? The labyrinth of tunnels beneath is dangerous and not meant for just anyone to explore. Back in 1976, tragedy struck at the Santa Rosa Blue Hole. Two divers lost their lives in the narrow tunnels beneath, and it took weeks before their bodies were found. To prevent another tragedy, the authorities decided to permanently close the entrance. The Army Corps of Engineers filled the opening with rocks and sealed it with a metal grate, hoping that no more lives would be lost down there. For decades, the tunnels were left alone, ignored and forgotten. But in 2013, things changed. The ADM Exploration Foundation asked to remove the grate so experts could explore and properly map the system. They believed that if they could evaluate the passages, the Blue Hole might become an amazing site for experienced cave divers. It took years just to clear out the rocks and debris blocking the entrance, but eventually they were ready to see what lay below. What drives someone to keep exploring, even when the path seems impossible? In 2016, the team was finally ready. A group of 10 expert divers planned a 3-day mission to explore and map the caves beneath the Blue Hole. Among them were Mike Young and Shane Thompson, two of the best cave divers around. Both had spent decades perfecting their skills, and they were perfect for the job ahead. On March 26, 2016, it was the final day of their dive mission. Mike and Shane had spent the last few days trying to find safe passages through the cave. But things hadn't gone quite as they hoped. The cave was not what they expected. It wasn't a series of clear tunnels, but rather a chaotic pile of boulders and small rocks, with only a few narrow channels here and there. A massive column of car-sized boulders stretched down 120 feet, and there was no safe route through it. It was a bit of a letdown for the team. They realized this cave would not be suitable for future recreational divers, but Meek was still glad they had given it a thorough look. He wanted to make sure they didn't miss any possible pathways that might be worth exploring. With a straightforward yet risky plan, Mike and Shane prepared to dive deeper into the unknown, a place where every breath counts. The plan for their final day was straightforward but challenging. Mike and Shane were going to dive down to a tight spot at 140 feet, and then Mike would continue to a second restriction at 165 feet. Shane was going to wait behind in the open area, keeping an eye out. He even brought his GoPro camera along, ready to capture what could be their last journey through the rocky maze of the Blue Hole. Mike carefully followed the line he had laid out during the past few days. He moved slowly, maneuvering through each tight space with his side mount tanks at his sides. Attached under his arms, Mike had a rebreather system, which was crucial for a dive like this. A rebreather works differently from regular scuba tanks. Instead of just releasing the air you exhale, a rebreather takes it back in, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide and making it safe to breathe again. Since most of the oxygen in the exhaled air is still usable, this system allows divers to stay underwater much longer than they could with standard tanks. It was the kind of advanced equipment that Mike needed to navigate through this strange maze of boulders deep below the surface. Mike had already explored beyond the 165-foot depth the day before, knowing it was just one tight squeeze after another, with nothing much to see. What happens when you decide to go off plan in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth? Once Mike's fins disappeared into the cloudy water, Shane made a quick decision. It wasn't part of their plan, and Mike wouldn't know, but Shane decided to follow. Something inside him made him want to see what was beyond that hole, even though it wasn't what they had agreed on. The guideline twisted and turned along a jagged path, winding up over massive boulders the size of cars, then dropping down again through tight, rocky turns. At one point, it even passed through a narrow hole just 3 feet wide. As Shane followed along, the water around him became murky, but he kept the line firmly in his hand, using it as his guide. Soon, Shane faced another tight spot ahead. He paused for a moment. It looked really small. He turned his body slightly to the side and started pulling himself along the rocks. But his back-mounted rebreather was getting caught on a rock that hung down from the top of the tunnel, making it even harder to squeeze through. Shane twisted and turned, trying to squeeze through, but soon found himself wedged against the tunnel wall, unable to move. Shane pushed against the rocks to try to move backward, but his gear was getting stuck against the rocks behind him. He knew that if he pushed too hard and damaged his rebreather, it could be disastrous. He had to be careful, but he was stuck, and things were not looking good. Shane kept pulling and pushing, but his breathing started to get faster and shallower. Even with all his experience, getting stuck triggered a natural primal fear. His survival instincts kicked in. He began to move more frantically, his careful control slipping away. Just then, in the middle of the panic, an arm suddenly bumped into his head. It was Mike. Face to face in the tight, dark space, Shane's eyes were wide, but for the first time, he felt a small sense of relief. He wasn't alone, even at 195 feet below the surface. How do you keep your composure when both your life and someone else's are hanging by a thread? Shane quickly told Mike he was stuck and needed help. Mike tried all the same moves Shane had already attempted, pushing and pulling to free him, but after a few minutes, nothing was working, and both men were getting anxious. Shane couldn't move, and Mike wouldn't be able to leave unless he could get Shane free. Finally, Mike had an idea. He helped Shane twist his body in one direction, freeing the rebreather from the rocks. Then with all his strength, Mike pulled while Shane pushed with his trapped hand. Suddenly, Shane was free. He burst through the tunnel, and Mike pulled him into the small terminal room. It was a tight space, just a few feet wide, but for the moment, they could both catch their breath and regroup. Shane was beginning to calm down, but he was shaken by what had just happened. Mike, on the other hand, looked confused. He had no idea why Shane had even followed him into that part of the cave. Shane knew he had made a mistake. His back-mounted rebreather made it much harder to maneuver compared to Mike's side mount, which allowed for more control in tight spaces. Mike signaled for Shane to go first and make his way back through the restriction where he'd gotten stuck. This time, Shane was able to carefully drag his body through without getting trapped. Once Shane was through, Mike followed behind. But as he worked his way out, the worst possible thing for a cave diver happened. The guideline slipped from his hand. Shane, in his haste, had pulled the line too hard, and now Mike was left in complete darkness. He was stuck at the bottom of the blue hole in an unfamiliar maze of rocks, without the guide that could lead him to safety. Mike was in trouble. He frantically felt around for the guideline, but there was nothing. No rope, no clear way forward, just darkness. He was lost. Now Shane had lost the line. His heart started pounding, and his breathing quickened. In a rebreather, this was especially dangerous. Breathing too fast could cause a buildup of carbon dioxide in his mask, and if the CO2 scrubber couldn't clear it in time, it could be fatal. Controlled breathing was essential, and Shane knew it well. He fought to calm himself down, but panic was setting in again. He reached around in the murky water, feeling for the line. All he found were a series of small holes, too narrow for him to pass through. It felt like being trapped in a coffin with no way out. Shane was in serious trouble, and he knew it. Shane thrust his arm through the narrow holes, hoping to find a way out. Suddenly, he felt Mike, giving him a glimmer of hope. Determined, Mike searched for an opening and finally found a way to reach Shane, grabbing his shoulder to calm him down. As Shane swam past Mike in the narrow tunnel, he realized, too late, that he had made yet another mistake. The passage became even tighter, and now he was pressed right up against Mike with nowhere to go. Panic set in completely. He thrashed and kicked, fighting to break free. All his training and experience were gone. Shane was just trying to survive. How far would you push yourself when survival is the only thought in your mind? In the struggle, he tore his wetsuit and scraped his body against the jagged rocks below. Somehow, he managed to jerk himself free and kicked with everything he had. Ahead, the guideline appeared in the murky water. Shane grabbed it, and the only thing on his mind now was getting out of this maze of rocks, getting to safety. He moved too quickly, far too fast for a cave environment, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. His breathing had sped up again, and the rebreather wasn't able to keep up. Shane grabbed his bailout bottle, his emergency backup. Unlike the rebreather, the bailout bottle was just regular compressed air. As he took in breath after breath, the exhaled air floated up into the water above, and he didn't have to worry about carbon dioxide building up in the mask. He was desperate to escape, and this was his best chance. Shane reached the next tight restriction and, without hesitation, forced his body through it. He pulled on the rocks with all his strength, desperately trying to move forward. But this was a big mistake, a catastrophic one. He got stuck. This was the third time during the dive, and now he found himself wedged in a space far too small for a diver with tanks. The pressure of the rocks squeezed his body from every direction, and he had no idea what to do next. He thrashed in the water, trying to free himself, but he had no clear sense of where he was. The water around him was thick with silt, and he didn't know if Mike would be able to find him this time. Panic threatened to take over again. What would you do if your lifeline vanished in the depths of a dark, unforgiving cave? Meanwhile, Mike was also struggling. As he moved through the second squeeze, the guideline suddenly jerked out of his hand and disappeared into the silt. He stopped, feeling around the rocks, trying to find it. There were small gaps where the line could have slipped through, but he found nothing. Mike knew he couldn't just move forward blindly. Without the guideline, that could be dangerous. There were areas in the cave where passages led to dead ends, or narrowed so much that turning around would be impossible. One wrong move, and he could end up in a place with no way out. Caution was key, but the clock was ticking, and Shane was somewhere ahead in trouble. Mike felt his own panic rising. He knew very well how dangerous it was to move in the wrong direction down here. He forced himself to stay calm, taking a breath before making any sudden moves. Carefully, he swam upward, feeling around for any possible openings he could take. He managed to find a gap above the path, and after squeezing through, a wave of relief washed over him. The guideline was right there, just in front of him. He grabbed hold of the line and began to follow it again, carefully navigating through the next restriction. He pulled himself up by gripping a rock above, when suddenly a hand shot out from a hole in the rock and grabbed onto him with an iron grip. Startled, Mike was momentarily confused, but then he realized it was Shane. What happens when even the most experienced diver loses control in a fight for survival? Mike looked through the opening and saw Shane. Shane was frantic, completely panicked, struggling, and separated from the guideline. It didn't matter that Shane had decades of experience. Once that survival instinct kicked in, everything else faded away. At times like this, even the most skilled divers could fall victim to the body's natural fight-or-flight response. When faced with fear, the brain sends out a flood of hormones and stress signals, pushing you into survival mode. All rational thinking takes a back seat. In that moment, your only focus is to get out, to escape no matter what. And that's exactly where Shane was now, his mind locked in survival mode, lost in panic. Mike knew what kind of mental state Shane must be in, but he wasn't quite prepared for what happened next. He found an opening and reached in to grab Shane's shoulder, hoping to calm him. But the moment Mike touched him, Shane panicked even more. With wild eyes, he lunged forward toward the guideline, moving so quickly that he ended up wedging both of them in the narrow passage. Mike was now pressed against the rock, facing the pocket, while Shane swam underneath him, trying to get to the line. It forced the two men into a head-to-toe position, stacked in a tight space, over 180 feet below the surface. Shane began thrashing, kicking in desperation to escape, while Mike had to shield his face from the sharp kicks to his head. How do you stay calm when everything goes wrong deep underwater? It was a terrifying and almost unreal moment. Two divers, completely alone, trapped in a narrow underwater tunnel. Mike knew they had to find a way out quickly, or things would turn even worse. He managed to push his legs upward against a spot above him, creating just enough space for Shane to squeeze his hips past the rock sticking out. As soon as Shane managed to clear the restriction, Mike lost his balance and fell straight down into the hole beneath them. Mike was stunned. He lay still for a few moments, trying to gather himself. He realized he was mostly okay, and his equipment was still functioning, but he wasn't unscathed. A valve on his suit had torn open, which meant that the cold 52-degree water was now leaking inside. Hypothermia was becoming a real threat. On top of that, he had lost a fin and had to feel around in the murky water to find it. When every move could be the difference between life and death, how do you stay focused and make the right choice? After a few deep breaths, Mike made a decision. He wouldn't take a single move unless it was with clear intent to get out of this maze. He needed to stay focused if he wanted to survive, but once again, he was without the guideline. In a completely silted-out cave, losing the guideline could mean certain death. Mike methodically started moving upward, looking for any possible openings. He carefully chose his path, moving slowly and deliberately, and then luck was on his side again. Just a few moves later, he spotted the guideline in a hole above him. Relief washed over him as he grabbed it and followed it through the next tight restriction. Mike hadn't seen Shane for a while, but he assumed that Shane was ahead of him. He could feel movement on the line, which meant that Shane was also making his way toward the exit, somewhere higher on the guide. As Mike reached the next tie-off on the line, he suddenly noticed the movement had stopped. A sense of worry hit him immediately. If the line wasn't moving, it meant Shane wasn't ahead. He was actually still behind, holding on to an earlier part of the guideline. Mike turned around and began heading back down, his concern for Shane growing. He knew how dangerous Shane's earlier panic had been, not just for Shane, but for both of them. Mike had to squeeze himself through another uncomfortable restriction, following the line back down into the maze of boulders. Then the line went completely still, no movement at all. Mike knew what that could mean. Shane was in serious trouble. He moved along the line until he came upon a shocking sight. There was Shane, stuck in a tight restriction, not moving at all. His rebreather regulator wasn't even in his mouth anymore, and his bailout bottle was out. His wetsuit was torn in several spots, and the cord to his dive computer was ripped away. Shane had clearly fought hard to free himself, but it was too late. Mike could see it now. Shane was gone. Mike checked Shane and tried to remove his equipment, hoping to free him, but it quickly became clear that it wouldn't be possible. He had to get back up, make his decompression stops, and tell the others what had happened. It was the hardest decision, but there was nothing more he could do for Shane. It took Mike hours to safely return to the surface. He had to go through long decompression stops and then take time to warm up before he could speak to anyone about what had happened. How do you find the strength to dive back into the depths where you lost a friend? Since Mike was the only diver there who had made it past the 140-foot restriction, it would be up to him to recover Shane's body the next day. It was a heavy burden, but there was no one else who could do it. The GoPro footage confirmed that Shane's panic overwhelmed him, and he ran out of air, leading to his tragic end. Despite all his experience, Shane fell victim to panic, and it ultimately cost him his life. The series of close calls had put him in a frantic state, and in that final emergency, he couldn't keep calm. It was a tragic end, showing just how quickly things could go wrong, even for the most experienced divers.